I hope that all of them can join with us to have your teaching, guest lecturing for today. So the students, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you. I would like to introduce Dr. Lauren. Okay, she works in the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, Department of Health, Behavior and Society, John Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Now she is the assistant scientist in Department of Health, Behavior and Society, and she has the Ph.D. on 2018 in Health, Behavior and Society from John Hopkins University. So it means that she's the expert for the behavioral change. If you're doing your research concerning for that, I hope Dr. Lauren can help us to have this further research. Thank you, Dr. Lauren, for having lecturing with us. We will have like 35 until 40 minutes, and then the question. Is it okay with you?
That sounds great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I guess in the interest of time, I can just get started. But I do want to say that if there are any clarifying questions while I am presenting that you would like to ask, please go ahead. And are you seeing my notes or the slides?
I think now we can see the slide.
Just the slides. Okay, perfect. All right. So I did want to start with a bit of an overview. So I'll focus predominantly on the analysis part of qualitative data and presenting results. But I did want to make sure that I discussed how I think about and define qualitative data, and this might be familiar to some of you, maybe new concepts to others, but this type of data is generally related to concepts or opinions, values, and behaviors or behavior change of people in a social setting or social context. And there's really a range of qualitative data. So this can, be recordings and transcripts of interviews that you do, so one-on-one or small group interviews, or recordings and transcripts of focus groups, so groups of, 7 to 10 people. You could also qualitatively analyze videos or photographs or notes about some type of observation you're doing, so looking at something in a natural setting. You can also use documents, so reading document text for meaning, field notes and memos. So these are things that the researcher themselves jots down about a particular social setting that they're investigating. Qualitative data analysis is broadly the process of organizing that data. So organizing it, examining it, and transforming it in order to draw conclusions and support decision-making later. And so data analysis really provides us with the basis for informed and verifiable conclusions. It's an iterative, ongoing process that involves identifying, and interpreting patterns and themes in textual data or visual data. And the ultimate goal of qualitative data analysis is to examine meaning. So it's to describe how people see the world, or to explore the context of the world in which people are acting or behaving. You can also examine the process. So how does a patient enter a clinic and is served based on their health needs? You also could investigate what actions and activities people do and their reasoning. So why do they act and behave as they do? There's two primary approaches in the literature around qualitative analysis. So the first is what we call a deductive approach. And under this approach, your analysis would really be based on a predetermined structure. And so the research question really that you have guides how the data are grouped and they're analyzed. And this is the most appropriate approach when, your time and potentially your resources are limited, or, when your study is perhaps a smaller study, or you have a guiding framework that you are already operating under. The second approach is a little bit broader. It's known as the inductive approach. And this is really appropriate when you don't know too much about a topic. So what you're really doing is looking at the data to tell you what's happening. So you're looking for relationships or processes that you don't have any predetermined concepts around. And that's how you're conducting your analysis. And this can be a pretty time-consuming process because you're constantly going from your notes about your data back to your data to confirm, sort of the patterns that you're seeing. There's several important terms that I did want to define, and we'll talk about these a little bit later. But just to provide you with a framework, the first term is theory. So theory describes sort of the set of what we call interrelated concepts that presents this structured view of a process or an event or some type of phenomenon, whether it's purchasing behavior of individuals in a particular country or region. The next important term is coding, and I will talk about this a lot. And coding is the process of sort of attaching labels to lines of your text or pieces of imagery or pieces of video so that you as a researcher can group and compare these pieces of information at a later time. And finally, themes are sort of the category of ideas that emerge often from those coded pieces of text or imagery. And these are like more broadly concepts related to your research question. So I did want to provide you with the general procedures that are involved in qualitative data analysis. And there's really 4 main procedures and a 5th one if you sort of get there. But the general process involves organizing your data, then identifying your coding plan, actually coding your data, and then conducting a descriptive analysis. You could also conduct a second order analysis, and we'll discuss each of these, including second order analysis in detail in the slides that follow. So the first step is to organize the data. And this really means that you first transcribe your data. So if you recorded an interview or you recorded a discussion between a focus group of 10 participants, you would have an audio recording of that group. And you would take that audio recording and transcribe it into actual physical textual format. You can use a software to do this. There are some available. The accuracy sort of varies based on the source. Or you could hire a company to do this. You could do it yourself, although I will say that for every hour of recorded interview or focus group, it takes about 6 hours to transcribe. So it is fairly time consuming. I do recommend that if you're new to qualitative analysis, that you do transcribe at least one interview or focus group, just so that you can sort of get closer to the data. You can understand, how you take what's spoken and write it into text. And, sometimes there are things that you have to make decisions about, perhaps, whether you include, if someone says, a lot, or, or whether someone laughs, like that data, that information can either be included in your transcript or it's not. And that's totally up to you. But doing a transcript yourself will sort of give you a better understanding of how that process works. If necessary, so if you're collecting data in a language that you don't plan to analyze the data in, then you would need to translate the data. And I think that this process, the researcher should also be involved, or at least talk to the individuals that are doing the translation, just so you understand kind of how that's going to be done. If those things that I mentioned, laughter or pauses will be also translated, etc. And then finally, you want to clean your data. So what this means is checking for quality. So maybe you would, listen to a part of the audio recording and look at the transcript and see if they match up in an appropriate way. And so that you have more certainty in your data representing what actually occurred in your group or in your discussion. The next main phase of the data analysis steps is identifying a coding plan. And so the first step in this process is to read and then read again and then read again your data. And I can't emphasize this enough. You really need to be familiar with all of the data content that you have before you really start to develop and finalize your coding plan. We'll discuss coding in depth somewhere else, but generally there's two different approaches. We can either use an open approach to developing how you'll code the data. So this means that you're sort of reading through the data, and as you read and read and read, you're taking notes as you go, and then you're using those notes later to help develop your codebook. You could also have a structured guide based on, perhaps you have a theory that you're looking at. So there's different concepts in your theory. So you already know that you're going to code for those concepts. And generally people kind of use a combination of these two. And then, you want to test your coding structure against, a few transcripts, make adjustments as necessary as you move towards finalizing it. Conducting the descriptive analysis, here's where you code your raw data. So I've been talking a lot about transcripts, text data, or, so it could be transcripts, it could be documents, could also be images. And here's where you look at those really critically and you apply the different codes that you've established. After you apply those codes, you sort of can use those codes to identify broader themes. So what I mean by themes is just really identifying patterns in how different codes appear within and across your cases. So within transcripts and across transcripts, within documents and across transcripts, within images and across transcripts. How do these codes show up that tells you a broader story about the pattern of, what's occurring? So whether it's a process or it's decision-making around purchases, etc. Then you ask yourself, some key questions to sort of get there. So you can say, what are some interesting stories that this data is telling me? What are those common patterns that are emerging? Do these patterns suggest that maybe I need to go out and collect more information to better understand this? Something seems really important, but you can't really understand what's going on in the current data that you collected. And then you can also compare what you're sort of finding to other literature or other studies that you know about. And that's always very helpful in sort of getting you to the descriptive analysis part. After you've conducted your initial descriptive analysis, you may decide you need to conduct a second order analysis. And what this means is that you're developing a theory about the themes and the patterns in your data. And not every study or research question needs this, but maybe you are looking at how people make decisions around purchasing goods. And there's a sort of sequence of events that happens that your data suggests, and you're going to kind of describe how that sequence of events occurs or unfolds. In a second order analysis, you can also sort of examine the gaps in your findings and plan for next steps for future research. That might not be as applicable to some of the students on the call, but that's definitely something that researchers at the Institute of Global Tobacco Control often do. We kind of look and see, well, what are the things we don't understand from this data, and what do we need to do to advance our understanding in order to inform tobacco control policy? All right, so I'm going to get into coding in more detail. And really, it can't be said more that coding is the backbone or the foundation of qualitative data analysis. So as we talked about before, codes are defined as those labels that you assign to selected pieces of text or selected images that give them meaning. So, you could assign codes to phrases, full sentences, whole paragraphs. And codes really help us sort of flag our data to summarize and synthesize what is happening within that text or within that imagery. And by looking at the different coded pieces, we can, start to build those scenes, start to interpret the data to something larger than just a conversation between two individuals. So it's not just about one interview, it's about what all 10 of those interviews really tell you about a process or decision making. So coding, just briefly, it describes, it's the first major step in this analysis, and it really allows researchers to reduce and simplify the data, as I mentioned. And I personally often develop my codes before I begin my analysis, but you may also find that as you are coding your data, as you are assigning labels to different pieces of text or images, there might be other codes that your current codebook is missing that you think are important, and that's totally okay. You would just maybe, add those in as you're moving along with your analysis. And that's often the case of what happens when you're conducting this type of analysis. It's really important to just keep in mind that your research questions are really important in terms of how you develop your codebook and how you use your codebook. And so always keep those in mind and kind of assign codes to your data for answers to those research questions. And I always like to kind of just keep a notebook by me as I am coding my data, and I'm starting to notice those themes, those emerging patterns across transcripts or across images. And I just sort of write down those theoretical kind of notes around the larger patterns that I'm finding in the data. There are 3 approaches to developing codes. And so these terms should be familiar to you. As we talked about, there's 2 main types of qualitative data analysis. So the first type of developing codes is an inductive approach. So it's really that more exploratory process that relies on the text itself to help you identify words or phrases to really form your codes. And you'll begin by just reading your data or looking at your data. And as you read it and get more familiar with it, you'll start to develop these more focused, refined codes that will then be formalized into your codebook. The second approach is deductive. So again, this is kind of the approach that I talked about, where you use your research questions, or maybe you use a theory that you're learning in a class to help you really create topical codes related to different concepts in that theory or related to different concepts in your research question. Most often what people end up doing is having a hybrid approach. So they'll always have a research question in mind, and maybe they have a research question and a guiding theory. And so that will inform their codebook. But as we talked about, as you read your transcripts or look at your data, you might realize that you're missing some things and you want to create more codes. And that's a bit more of that inductive process. And so what you end up with is a hybrid approach. And that's definitely okay. I tell a lot of students that I work with that your code book's really never final until you code the last piece of of data, so the last transcript, because, you know, things kind of do shift a lot in qualitative data as you start getting more and more familiar with your with the data that you collected. What I want to kind of clarify what I mean a codebook is and show you some examples, because this is really like the practical part of developing codes. It's actually, you know, a document that should be very structured and informative. And so what a codebook is a set of your codes, a definition for that code, and examples that should be used by you, you and members of your team as a guide to help you analyze the data. And so how I like to structure codebooks is I start with the code, the definition, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, so cases when this code applies and cases where this code would not make sense to use. And then guidelines, more explicit. So perhaps, you know, use this code only when it corresponds to this scenario. And so the more explicit you are about how the code should be used, the better quality of data you'll have, especially when you have multiple coders. And then I always like to provide an example from the data itself for every scenario that I'm discussing, so that there's no questions about when something would apply or not. As I mentioned before, codebooks are iterative, so it happens over time, and you just get more and more specific until you kind of formalize it to a point where you can apply it consistently across all of your data. You know, as I mentioned, coding is really often carried out in teams of 2 or more. And I think this is particularly true if you're doing studies where you're potentially conducting 30 interviews or, you know, 30 focus groups. That's a lot of data to code by yourself. And so, you know, having someone else code with you or multiple people code with you can really reduce the amount of time it takes to do the analysis. And it can also, we'll talk about this at the end of the lecture, but it can also make sure that, you know, you're bringing in different viewpoints that can help ensure the robustness of your results. What I will say about using team coding is that it's really important that all parties are involved in the codebook development, if possible. If someone can't take a lead in developing the codebook, at least they should be able to review it and weigh in on it. And as a whole team, you should just sort of decide the different parameters of your codes. And once there's agreement on the scope of your codes and definitions and your instructions on how to use, then you can, you know, start coding and sort of be more secure in ensuring that everyone is coding in the same way and that it's reliable. There are sort of ways to formally establish reliability. And the general rule is that you take a 10% sample of your data. So let's say in the case that I described before, you have 30 transcripts of interviews. Then you would both independently, and you have 2 coders. So both of those coders would code the same 3 transcripts, and you would look across the coded transcripts to see if the coding was the same. And you can do this in many different ways. There's statistical software that will actually create estimates of reliability for you, or you can kind of just, you know, have a Zoom call or meet in person and just go over the transcripts together, depending on the number. But really what you're trying to do is find, you know, where codes are consistent and where they're not. And in the cases where coding is not consistent, you really need to review the codebook as a team and make adjustments to that codebook as necessary. And I would say if you have sort of longer term projects, or if you're bringing in new individuals into the coding, it's not a bad idea to test for reliability again. So again, take another 10% sample and just have your whole team code those same, and just make sure that everyone is still on the same page, or that the new individuals are at the same level as the staff that's already been working on the project. Excuse me. So I did want to give an example of some codes and definitions. So this isn't the full code book, but just, some ideas. And this is from a e-cigarette marketing study in Russia that we did. So we looked at how companies were marketing electronic cigarette products online in the country of Russia. And so on the left-hand panel, you can see the codes listed for marketing appeal. So some of these include that, electronic cigarettes are more environmentally friendly. They help with smoking cessation. You can use them anywhere. So you could use them in places where, generally smoking is not allowed. And so on the right-hand side, you can see sort of those more formal definitions of each of these codes. And I'll take you through a few examples of the content that we coded to sort of demonstrate this. So on this slide, you'll see two images that are from Russian websites that were advertising electronic cigarettes. And these are examples of images that were coded as communicating reduced harm and comparing electronic cigarettes to regular cigarettes. And so at the bottom of the slide, you'll see the definition of the code, that it conveys a health benefit or reduced harm as compared to cigarette smoking. And we applied this code when comparisons to health risks were mentioned for cigarette smoking. And so you can see in this example that you're eliminating the tar and the ash and the unwanted additives from your cigarette by using these white cloud e-cigarettes. In this slide, it provides examples of images and messages that were coded as circumventing smoking policy. So the definition of this code was an image that describes the ability to use the product anywhere while also including explicit references to smoke-free policies. And so this code was applied to messages that indicated the ability to use the product where smoking was expressly prohibited. And so in the image on the left, you can see that the smoking ban is directly mentioned. So those words, "Dear Smoking Ban," at the top, and then a woman in that image is making an obscene gesture at the band. So this is just a very explicit example of this code. Well, the image on the right suggests that, e-cigarettes can be used anywhere, even outside of areas that are designated for smoking. And so I hope that this gives you a sense of how you apply codes to different pieces of your data. In this case, our data was imagery of website advertising, which has both, actual images as well as textual elements that we coded for. I will close this section by saying that coding is sort of the primary way, regardless of the data that you have, that allows you to identify themes within the data. So it's really taking those pieces of your data, so whether they're paragraphs or sentences or just a phrase or an image, and really breaking that down so that you can then reconstruct those different pieces into larger themes. And so, in that way, the coding process allows us to highlight important information in the data prior to our interpretation. But in interpreting the codes, then we get those larger themes. So we can kind of, compare frequencies in the occurrence of codes and themes. So what things kind of happen together. It's, in the first example that I showed you, saying that electronic cigarettes are less harmful and better than cigarettes are things that kind of co-occurred in the marketing images that we saw. And that's pretty meaningful because it's sort of conveying a particular message to consumers that may or may not be true based on the data, based on the existing scientific information that we have. And, there's different ways that you can use software or, even pen and paper to sort of graphically represent relationships between codes. And we'll sort of get into that in a little bit. But, really the interpretation of your codes and sort of taking those small segments and building them into those larger thematic relationships is really sort of the primary process of qualitative data analysis. All right. In this, I'll talk about different approaches to analysis after you code the data. And really, there's a few different ones, but I will say that thematic analysis, which may be a familiar term to some of you, is the most common. And it does have those same structured of steps that I talked about before. So it's really reading through your data and reading it again and reading it again until you're very, very familiar. Doing the coding, so kind of breaking down the information and collapsing data into those labels of smaller pieces of text or smaller images to create categories, and then combining those categories and codes into our overarching themes and defining what those themes are. In the reporting phase, so in the kind of how you end up presenting this information, whether it's, to stakeholders or policymakers, or perhaps you're writing a peer-reviewed journal article, you really need to, at that point, decide which themes are the most meaningful to you to understanding sort of the phenomenon of interest in your research question. And so in that reporting phase, it's really that's where you reduce your data again. You have all these themes, but you select the ones that are like the most relevant to your research question or to the, goal of your study. So this is just a graphic way to show that, multiple codes can inform, the same code can inform multiple themes, and that multiple codes are kind of taken together to inform a broader theme or a broader pattern in your data. And so I just kind of wanted to graphically display that. All right. So the next framework that's less common, but also useful, is the framework approach, the framework analysis. And so this is really a policy or practice-oriented method. And it's often used when there's some type of overarching theory or evidence, like process of evidence generation that you're considering. So in the field of public health, which is my field, a lot of times we talk about implementation science. And really what that means is sort of how you set up different processes in healthcare settings to address the needs of patients, and really identifying what facilitates meeting patients' needs and what are barriers to meeting patients' needs. And it's a very concrete set of constructs. And framework analysis is often used when you have something guiding like that, because you're sort of putting things into different practice-related buckets that, kind of have an overall theoretical underpinning. So I won't get into this in too much detail because it's a little less common, but, the first two steps are the same as far as, familiarizing yourself with your data, coding your data, and sort of combining it into overarching themes. But then, there's these different approaches afterwards where you index, chart, and map your data. And so you're sort of seeing how those concepts operate between and within cases. And so cases in this example could be perhaps an interview with a patient. So that's one case. And then you compare that against another interview with the patient to see if the same sort of factors are playing out in a similar way. And then based on this comparison, you'll sort of rearrange the data and then draw a diagram for your final sort of set of results. It's not actually a very commonly used practice, but I did want to bring it up and just have this in the slides available to you in case it's potentially of use. The third approach is called grounded theory. And so grounded theory is really a systematic method that relates to the construction of a theory through gathering and analyzing data. And so this is the most inductive approach. You really kind of use your data to inform your research question, to inform whether you collect more data. And it's kind of a very cyclical process that kind of stops when you sort of feel like you've reached the point of saturation and that no new ideas are coming up based on new interviews you're doing or any new data that you've collected. And so this approach is actually used to generate larger theories that would guide, our work, whether it's in, business or economics or public health. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. I did want to say that there are some of you might be thinking about conducting observational research. And so this is collecting, data, like observing people in a natural setting. So maybe you're observing how policymakers discuss a law related to some type of economic regulation, and you want to note down sort of how people interact with each other, what's being said, what are the different steps in how a law is reviewed. What you really, would do with this is start with describing what the process is from start to end. So kind of, from step one to step Z, and describe key events that happen. So whether that's a vote happens, but initial vote happens, and then a final vote happens. And you would describe sort of the process for how that happens. You would want to also, describe the place and the setting that the behavior events occurred and the people. So who's there? Maybe what are they dressed like? How are they interacting with each other? And then, again, those key procedural elements that happen when you're sort of observing this behavior in a natural setting. So this is kind of the same, some of the same approaches would be helpful that we talked about with coding image or text-based data. But observations are slightly different, and I did just kind of want to nod to that. And so this would kind of be my stepwise approach for how you would use that information that you gathered in sort of an analysis process. All right, so I did want to just briefly talk about analytic software. So I do want to say that you don't need to buy analytic software to analyze your data, but what software does is it kind of helps you organize, and it enhances your ability to manipulate data and sort of see the links between different transcripts or different data sources in your sample set. But what it doesn't do is the analytical thinking for you. You have to, still engage in that process, and you still need to code that data. And it doesn't actually enhance reliability, although it does. There are some programs that do allow you to some programs that will run those statistical calculations for reliability. So it eases that process if you did want to use a statistic to assess how reliable your coders are. Traditionally, people used to, cut up the paper of their transcripts. They would make multiple photocopies and just cut out the sections that they were coded by, coding for a certain code. And I think that the software that we have developed just there's nothing wrong with this process, but the software really helps you, do your analysis quicker. And so you'll just kind of, when you're considering software, you want to, think about how much money and time you have available, whether you're working as a team, how much data you have. And, there are several that are available that are very low cost. And so the first three, Hyper Research in particular and Deduce, are really great. And they actually are online. And so that means that you can use them anywhere. And multiple people can be on the same software and using the same data set at the same time, which is really great. And then you have, more expensive software that's a little bit more sophisticated and what it can do, and perhaps a bit more user-friendly, with Max QDA being one of the most expensive softwares out there, but also one of the most user-friendly and straightforward software. And so it's just, something to consider. And really the basic steps of using the software and engaging in the analysis process are the same as what I described before. It's just, a few extra steps to kind of learn the program. So I did want to close on how to represent or present your findings. And there's, several formats for this. There's research reports, there's scientific articles. Maybe you have to write a report to a funder or create an evaluation report. And when you're thinking about how to present your data, you not only want to think about the format, but also the audience. So is it fellow academics? Are they more interested in, your conceptual framework and theory and your methods? Or is it practitioners that just, want to know, well, how do we improve what we're doing? Or policymakers who want to know, how do we strengthen the laws or the policies that we have in place? And then there's lay readers. So, people that just want general information or recommendations. And all of these sort of formats are, will require you to use quotes or images from your raw data that are illustrating a point and kind of explaining a range of findings. And so often when I choose quotes to put into a paper or into a report, I'll choose a quote that kind of is contains multiple codes so that it's sort of explaining the range of how things interact with each other. And you'll also, it might be important for you to consider presenting opposing views. So maybe you've interviewed policymakers about a new economic proposal, and you want to, 9 of your excuse me, I could feel that coming on. I apologize. 9 of the policymakers felt really strongly and positively about the law, and 1 didn't. You want to make sure that you include that individual's viewpoint to just show a balanced sort of assessment of your data. You want to also think about different ways that you can report without quotes. And so, you can kind of present sequences of events, and this is particularly true with observational data, or just really describe things in a lot of detail. And I'll show you some examples of that. The standard report format should probably be familiar to all of us. You kind of want to provide some introduction, some background, and really identify what you're doing with this data collection. Briefly or in detail, describe your methods. So, your participants or your locations, how you sampled and recruited, what type of data, how did you collect your data? Did you use an interview guide, and your analytical approach? And then, your results and your conclusions, where you restate your findings and you explain the implications of those findings. I did want to close by providing a few examples. So this is a recent 2-page fact sheet that one of my teams made to discuss findings from a qualitative study in Bangladesh. And you can see all the different components of a report there. And in the bubbles, kind of key quotes that we we use to demonstrate the findings that we were describing around attractiveness of smokeless tobacco products or perceived harm. There's also, different ways that you can report in peer-reviewed journals. And so in this case, I wanted to show that you can actually use tables to sort of describe your themes and potentially sub-themes within that. And it's a way of really summarizing the data very cleanly for individuals that are reading your report. And, also you can see that the authors provide quotes. So they don't provide quotes in the table, but they provide quotes in sort of the descriptive write-up. So it's a really nice way to present multiple themes in different summary formats for individuals. And then I wanted to, show how descriptions and images can be used in a different way. And so in this case, we were looking at feminine appeals on cigarette packs, and we used a table to sort of write what I would describe a narrative of the different feminine appeals or feminine concepts that occurred on cigarette packs based on our expert in-country reviewers. And then in order to supplement that, we provided the actual images of the packs. So these kind of worked hand in hand to really provide a narrative, but also physical imagery that people could understand. And, I also wanted to show that you can use numbers in your qualitative reporting when you report your qualitative data. And so in this case, we kind of just did very simple proportions, to present whether, something was absent or present on cigarette packs by larger categories of feminine appeals, like flowers or the image pink over time. And so what qualitative data analysis and reporting should not be is number phobic. And, there are times or instances when counting may be appropriate. And the previous example shows this. And, you might even want to say, in the example I gave before, that 9 out of 10 policymakers, were really positive about this bill, but one policymaker wasn't. Using numbers is not inappropriate, I will say. You should also be careful with, avoid overemphasizing really exotic or unusual situations. So you want to, be systematic and not sort of rely on anecdotes that might not reflect the consistency that you're seeing in your data. So one example of a really unusual case doesn't mean that that's actually what's happening when 29 of your other interviews say the opposite thing. And so you kind of want to not rely on using anecdotes or like very unique cases to pull quotes from, or to support some claim that might not be there with your data. And in the same way, you want to avoid overemphasizing patterns in your data. You can't know the full universe of something. And so just kind of being a little bit more conservative in terms of not saying that what you collected tells the full story, that there might be things that you've missed. And, finally, I just kind of wanted to close with some points on rigor. And so just throughout this entire process, you want to make sure that you keep these questions in mind. So, are your data collection tools appropriate to collect the type of data you want to collect? Are your methods appropriate in getting the level of detail you need? Should you perhaps look at different sources or interview more people? Do your analytic techniques allow you to examine your data in full? Or are you a little too limited with the analysis that you've selected, particularly if you're using sort of a deductive a priori approach? And then what checks are in place to ensure, the truthfulness or the veracity of your findings? And I won't go into this in detail because I know I'm over time, but there are criteria to establish rigor in qualitative research. And these terms might be familiar to some of you. And I've put a source to a paper that sort of describes this in more detail. But there are things that you can do to help you answer these questions and establish processes that will, really get your data up to that level that you're confident that your results are really reflecting what's happening with a particular phenomenon that you're investigating. So with that, I will close. Here is my email. And if you have Twitter and want to follow me, I'm at Lauren Lombard. And yeah, I can open it for questions. And I apologize for going over time a little.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lauren. I think we have 2 questions from the chat box. First is from Dr. Dimas. As a beginner, could you please suggest recommended books or references to further understand on qualitative technique? So I think most of the economics, we are having this qualitative as the new of research methodology. So probably you can suggest what kind of what books that would be recommended for us.
Sure. Yeah, I would be happy to send you. There are great articles that, if you didn't want to purchase a book, you could. I have a few great articles that I could share. There's also handbooks. There's a handbook on qualitative research, which kind of goes through all of the different types of qualitative data, which I wasn't able to cover today, and then more detail on analysis and reporting. So I'd be happy to email that out to everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lauren. I will email since I've already got the email address from the attendees. So I will be in charge.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Dr. Lauren. And from Khalifatul Fauzia, Dr. Lauren, thank you for your terrific presentation. Based on your explanations, I realize that I'm typical of deductive typical coding. I'm interested to be more explorative by using inductive or hybrid typical coding. Could you please explain more about the inductive typical coding and what tips for beginner who is not used to using this kind of coding? Okay, please.
Sure. Yeah, and I will say it's a great question, and you're not alone. I think a lot of us are sort of deductive, or we fall into that hybrid approach. I'll just say that this is where sort of the reading your transcripts multiple times really helps. And just, before you start to formalize anything, really doing that reading, kind of keeping an open mind about your data, and writing down things that are interesting is often where you start to pick up like different ideas. And so one example that I can give is for the smokeless tobacco fact sheet that I showed, in that data collection, we had a really deductive code book. But as we were reading, we started to realize that there were these different elements related to religion that were appearing on the smokeless tobacco packs. And we, this was an area that we didn't think that, we weren't really, we didn't have a research question about it. And we weren't expecting that, but that ended up being a really important piece of our data collection. So we created several codes around that. So codes around presentation of Hindu symbols, presentation, inclusion of Arabic text, things like that. So I think just kind of being curious about your data, keeping an open mind, and really doing that reading before you start to create, whether you're going to write out your code book or use, Word or Google Doc, just kind of just taking handwritten notes. I feel like that really helps with the creativity and sort of writing down things that are interesting that ultimately lead to new emergent codes.
Okay, wow, thank you, Dr. Lauren. I think this is the last questions, since we already more than 9 a.m. I know that after this you have another agenda. The last question is very interesting, from Dr. Romi Hartarto. Hi, Lauren, thank you for your presentation. I would like to know how important data saturation is in qualitative studies. Or do we still need to follow the rule of thumb in quantitative studies that larger sample is better? So I think it's a lot of people questioning about it, even though I also teach about the saturations in the qualitative data analysis. But I think it will be good if you are the one who can answer it. Please, Dr. Lauren.
Yeah, so this is probably the most frustrating answer, but there is no strong rule. I think that so there's several things you need to think about, like at the onset, like how much time do you have? How much money do you have? Do you need to have a report delivered within, 4 months? Like all of that can inform your sample size. I would say like 30 interviews is usually like the sample size that people, if they were going to give a number. I think using saturation is incredibly important. So if you start to see that, you plan to collect 30 interviews and you start to see at the 20th interview that, really like, we're not really learning anything new in these last 5 interviews that we did. Like maybe we're at a point where we can stop data collection. Like you'll never get that breadth that qualitative data or quantitative data collection gives you. But what you do want to note is that you kind of explored the depth and the sort of the range of concepts around your research question, and you're sort of satisfied with what you have. And I would say that too, if you are maybe you're interested in gender in your research question, and you think that men and women might respond differently, then you could either do 30 interviews with men and 30 interviews with women, or you could split between 15 interviews with men, 15 interviews with women. But at that 15th interview, you want to make sure, like, do I need anything more? It's really frustrating because there isn't a sample size calculation and there's not really like a good recommendation. It's just like in the literature around 30 interviews. I would say probably like 15, 20 focus groups. Like that's sort of what you generally see. And I think some of that's an artifact of time and resources, but oftentimes like you're able to sort of reach that point of saturation with that many groups, especially if you don't have subgroup analyses that you're doing.
Okay. Yes, it's the heterogeneity of respondent is important. Yes.
So this just depends on your question, yeah. And in focus groups, it might be. In focus groups, you might want to have people, that are very similar for the purposes of your research question. So yeah, I don't want to go over time. These are really thoughtful, great questions, and I appreciate them so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren. I know that you have another agenda on the 9 p.m. at your time. So thank you so much for your time. Probably we will invite you again, please.
All right. It was an honor to be here with everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Okay. Thank you for everyone for joining with us. We'll see you soon again, inshallah. And really thankful. Okay, bye-bye, Lauren. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.